Hello and welcome. I'm Ben Felder, the news director of the Piedmont Citizen, and joining me is the Citizen sports editor Ben Schuff. And Ben, we are entering week 9 of the high school football season, and we've got a lot to talk about today. We'll start by talking about Piedmont's loss last week to Anadarko, and then what that means for the final 2 weeks of the season. But we appreciate you tuning in. If you're watching, we've also got this as a podcast, so you can listen to this program. But Ben, let's start with last Friday's game, taking on the top team in the district, probably the top team in the state, in Anadarko. And it was a loss for Piedmont.
Yeah, they lost. Anadarko beat Piedmont 27-0. Anadarko jumped out to an early 14-0 lead. They scored on their first 2 possessions. Anadarko did pretty quickly too. The second touchdown they had, it only took them about 4 plays, and they went about, I think it was about 65 yards or so. Jumped out to that 14-0 lead, and then after that, Piedmont's defense really did a good job of kind of adjusting to the speed that some of Anadarko's position players, or skill position players, if you want to put it that way, had. Offense just could really never get going. It's about 100 yards, if I remember right, of a total offense they had. Anadarko's defense just really kind of stifled them all night long, and they just couldn't get a rhythm going. I think the longest drive, if I remember correctly, that Piedmont had against Anadarko went for about 30 or 35 yards. So they just could never really get anything going. And then Anadarko had the 2 touchdowns late in the game in the fourth quarter that kind of sealed the victory for them. So
yeah, and we knew it was going to be tough for Piedmont. I think there was maybe more optimism coming off of a big win against Clinton that we talked about. Such a brutal stretch against Clinton and Anadarko every year. And Piedmont was able to get the win against Clinton the week before, which was a big boost for them in terms of where they sit in the standings. And then a challenge against Anadarko, but nothing really. I mean, there's a lot of takeaways to take from the game, I suppose, but losing to the number 1 team in the state, I mean, it just kind of shows you how good I think Anadarko is more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of the players after the game on Friday kind of said what you did in terms of Anadarko was the number 1 team in the state for a reason. I mean, it wasn't a huge setback, I don't think, in terms of obviously Anadarko was a really good team, and you're obviously going in, Piedmont was going in with a lot of confidence, like you said, after the big win against Clinton. But I think in terms of, I don't think it's a setback for this week. You kind of regroup, and I think, obviously what we'll talk about here in a little bit in terms of the playoff picture, they're still in a pretty advantageous spot in terms of getting into the playoffs.
Yeah, well, 2 weeks left to go in the season, and let's take a look at the schedule. Both are road games. This Friday, Piedmont will take on Elgin, and then the final week of the season, they head to Weatherford. Now, when you take a look at the standings, Piedmont right now is in 3rd place in the districts. Of course, the top 4 teams go out of 8. Piedmont with a 4-4 record overall, but a 3-2 record in districts. They actually are tied with Clinton, but have that head-to-head tiebreaker. Now, as you said, there are a lot of different playoff scenarios that could play out over the next 2 weeks. The most simplest one is that if Piedmont just wins out, they're in.
Makes everything a lot easier.
Yeah. So the good news is that Piedmont is in control of their own destiny, and they're taking on teams that are Elgin and Weatherford are both the first 2 teams on the outside looking in to the playoffs. So they're going to be taking on some teams that have a lot to play for. But Piedmont has the upper hand. Before we start to talk about the different playoff scenarios, let's talk about Friday's game as the Wildcats travel to Elgin, who is 3-2 in districts.
Yeah, just like Piedmont, both teams have the same records coming in overall 4-4, 3-2 in district play. Elgin's kind of had to. They've won 2 games in a row, and that's really kind of got them back in the playoff picture, so to speak. They started district play at 1-2, had losses to, if I remember right, I think it was Woodward and Clinton early in the season, and then they've won the last 2 games, like I said, to kind of pull themselves back into it. And I talked with Jason Cunningham, their head coach, on Monday, and he said, it's basically just been a week-by-week approach. They know that the last 2 weeks, just like this week, if they want to get to the playoffs, they have to win. There's really no looking forward and seeing what other teams are doing, because like you said, they're kind of on the outside looking in right now. And in terms of Piedmont's playoff chances for this game, obviously kind of the same thing. I mean, you mentioned they kind of have an advantageous spot right now where they're at, because they started district play 3-1. But just like you said, this is a must win for Piedmont too. If they lose, Elgin would obviously hold a tiebreaker if that scenario were to present itself.
All right, we're back for the second half of our program, and to those watching on video, a little bit of an abrupt cut there as we had to make some adjustments with the camera. But when we took a break, we were talking about this Friday's game against Elgin. Now, Piedmont and Elgin both have identical records. Piedmont right now has more district points. They're higher in the barely, but they're higher in district seeding. The thing that's interesting to me is Piedmont. They're not out of it with a loss, and we'll talk about that. I mean, it makes their playoff chances a lot more grim. But Elgin is kind of in a must-win situation. So Piedmont's going on the road to play a team that, for lack of a better term, is playing a playoff game. This is playoffs for Elgin. So kind of a dangerous Elgin team, and I think we should expect kind of a good football team. But it sounds like Piedmont matches well in some areas against Elgin. Now, once again, Piedmont wins their next two games. They're in the playoffs. They have the third seed. There's nothing that anybody would be able to do about it. But here's a couple scenarios of which will be interesting to look at. If Piedmont were to lose to Elgin, then they would go into Weatherford with a must-win situation. Yeah. And if they were to beat Weatherford, which is 2-3 in districts right now, that would put Piedmont at 4-3. Now, Elgin has, I believe, as I'm pulling up their schedule right here, their last game of the season is against Anadarko. So if Elgin were to beat Piedmont on Friday, they would go into the last week of the season taking on the number one team in the state. You would assume that would be a loss. So then Elgin would also have 4 wins in district play. Clinton, who is 3-2 right now, and currently Piedmont has the tiebreaker on, they would be the interesting game because they take on Cache this week, which you would think would be a win. And then the last week of the season, they take on Woodward, and Woodward is in second place. So let's say that Clinton were to fall to Woodward in the final week of the season, you would have 3 teams, Piedmont, Clinton, and Elgin, all with a 4-3 record. Now, it's a mess, and it's a mess because the first tiebreaker is if Piedmont were to have wins over Clinton and Elgin, they would have the tiebreaker. Yeah. They would be seated ahead. If Clinton were to have 2 wins against Piedmont and Elgin, and if Elgin were, same thing. But because Piedmont would have a win over Clinton but a loss to Elgin, and Elgin would have a win over Piedmont and a loss to Clinton, it does make it a mess. And so, as best you can, give us maybe a little bit of insight into how the tiebreaker would work in that scenario.
Then it goes down to just scoring differential. And then really, you really can't overstate at that point how big the win over Clinton was, not only because it's put Piedmont in the situation it is now, but they gain. I mean, you can only put a cap on it. You can only gain 15 points. I mean, even if you win by say 21, win by 3 touchdowns, you can only gain 15 points in the district standings. But Piedmont gained those 15 points in that win over Clinton.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, if it was a closer game that Clinton game was. They don't have as many district points right now. I think they're 1 point ahead of Clinton. I think.
Piedmont has. Yeah, and when you're talking about margin of victory or loss. So, and that's only against district games. So, if a team were to beat someone by 7, they would gain 7 points. If they beat them by 21, like you said, they'd only gain 15. And it works the other way. If you get beat by 50, you only lose 15 points. Piedmont sits with 16 district points. Clinton has 15. Elgin has 10. So. You can envision a scenario where those 3 teams would be tied, but it's hard right now to say who has the upper hand because it just really depends on scoring.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind too, you kind of talked about who some of these teams play in the final weeks of the season. Anadarko finishes with Weatherford this week, and then Elgin, I believe, in the last week. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's hard to say, but there's obviously a potential there for Anadarko to beat both those teams, possibly. By a margin that would give them 15 points, or that would kind of bump Weatherford and Elgin down 15 points, which would obviously affect any potential sort of tiebreaker with Piedmont should that scenario present itself.
And that's why it does sound like I think Piedmont is in a good position because, like you said, I mean, they don't have to take on Anadarko in the last 2 weeks. They already did that, and they lost their 15 points. Because of it, they were sitting at 31 points, I believe, before the loss to Anadarko. But you're right; the teams that are chasing them would have to play Anadarko, and you would assume that would be 15. And there's one thing I was thinking about. You know, the rule of a 15-point cap, I would imagine, is in there so that teams don't try to run up the score on someone else. I don't know if that works because it seems like you see a lot of big scores all the time. But I don't know. I was thinking more about this. I thought, man, 15 is really kind of kind of a low number if you really think about it. I mean,
Yeah.
a game is still within reach if you're within 15 at some point. And
Yeah, I mean, I guess to your point, as far as the cap, I mean, that does seem like one reason to prevent teams from running up a score.
yeah, it doesn't really matter too much. I was just thinking about the fact that 15 to me kind of sounded like a low number to be
Yeah,
capped on.
I don't know. It doesn't. I mean, you think 2 touchdowns is kind of a team wins by. I mean, I'm trying to think of a recent football game where a team won by more than 2 touchdowns, but you thought it was closer than what that score would indicate.
Yeah, and if it sounds like I think Piedmont would be favored in its game against Elgin on Friday, but this is the potential to be a close game, and it does make for some interesting scenarios. So late in the game, if Piedmont does have a 10-point lead, you're not necessarily sitting on the ball with it.
Yeah.
I mean now you will see you could potentially see a Piedmont team with 4 minutes left to go with a 10-point lead, thinking, well, we got to go in the hurry up. We got to get into the end zone because we want those 15 points. Although beating Elgin kind of alleviates that 3-way tie.
Yeah.
Because if you beat Elgin, then Elgin is
Yeah,
is
a win this week by any margin would do a lot for Piedmont's playoff chances.
Yes, and Weatherford beating Elgin, then you'd be going into Weatherford. If that game won't matter because you already got a game on Weatherford, so it doesn't matter what Weatherford does this week. Now, if Piedmont were to lose to Elgin on Friday, they would have to beat Weatherford. Not only so they could hopefully be tied with Elgin, but if they lose to Elgin and then they lose to Weatherford could have there's a scenario where Weatherford could then leapfrog those teams and bump into there. So there is a lot of scenarios that could take place, but winning the next 2 is vital. But winning on Friday would be a huge step forward. And let's just as we conclude our program here, this would be. Making the playoffs would be the 3rd time in the last 4 years. That goes back before this current regime with Coach Church. But if they were to, it would be Church's 2nd time in his first 3 years here in Piedmont to make the playoffs. It seems like the last few years Piedmont has always been in the conversation of making the playoffs. They've been kind of that average team, at least when you look at the standings. It kind of, I think we talked a couple weeks ago about how they were 14-14 after Clinton in terms of the last 3 years. Now I guess they're 14-15, but. Tell me a little bit about you. I mean, you've watched every game. You've been there. You've talked to the coaches and players afterwards. Is this team playing better now than you feel like at the beginning of the season? And
Absolutely.
And are they playing better this year than even last year?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of I don't think there's any question at all that they are playing better now than they were at the beginning of the season. I mean, you look back, obviously, one of the things you look back, those first 2 games of the year, Deer Creek and Harrow, those are obviously 2 good teams. But those were games rather. Piedmont only scored 3 points in those 2 weeks. You've had games, the Elk City game, for instance. Obviously, it's one of the factors is the quality of the opponent, but Piedmont goes in there and puts up 50 points, and they beat Clinton rather handedly. You can say the injuries that Clinton had were part of that, whatever. But I mean, if you're just there at the games and you're watching the games. I mean, the defense is. It seems like every week, this whole month of October, the defense is not only doing what they can to keep them in games, but in some instances, helping them win games. The offense has improved, I would say, drastically from the beginning of the season. I mean, you look at obviously, I kind of touched on earlier, the running game has been pretty constant, but the passing game has improved a lot. The special teams play. I mean, you think back about that Clinton game. There were a couple of big returns that I don't remember the individual players, but there was a couple of big returns that Piedmont had against Clinton that helped them set up some pretty good field position. Obviously, the other thing too with that Clinton game, the special teams play. They had those 2 fumbled recoveries on the 2 kickoffs there in the 3rd quarter that pretty much all but sealed up the win for them. I mean, that really gave them the upper hand early in the 3rd quarter. They were able to go get a touchdown off one of those, and I think it was 38-19 after those 2 fumbles. So, point being, as I'm kind of long-winded here with the answer, that all 3 phases for Piedmont, I mean, from the beginning of the season to where they're at now, have improved drastically.
Yeah, and you want to play your best ball at the end of the season, and it seems like Piedmont is in position to do that. So, 2 weeks to go left in the regular season. Piedmont is in a good position to make the playoffs, and the fact that they control their destiny, but I don't know if I would use the word comfortable yet. Of course, the coaches aren't probably going to call themselves comfortable right now. But on the road against Elgin, then on the road against Weatherford the last 2 weeks of the season, we'll be there. So log on to PiedmontDaily.com following the game to get a reaction from coaches and players, recaps, video highlights, and more. Well, along with Ben Schuff, I'm Ben Felder here at the Piedmont Citizen, and we will see you again next week.